Greetings from the World Health Organization. In this brief presentation, I'd like to share 3 country-level experiences in building community support and responding to backlash to comprehensive sexuality education. But before I do that, I'd like to share some information about the context. In 2014, to mark the 20th anniversary of the International Conference on Population and Development, the Secretary General of the UN published a report to take stock of progress. And one of the statements that Ban Ki-moon made was that most adolescents and youth do not yet have access to comprehensive sexuality education, despite repeated intergovernmental agreements to provide it, support from the United Nations system, and considerable project-level experience in a wide range of countries and research showing its effectiveness. So, lots of research, tools underway, support provided, but very little large-scale and sustained country-level action. That's true for most countries, but not for all countries. In a small number of countries, they've been able to break the barrier of small-scale pilot projects, short-lived projects, and move to large-scale and sustained programs. Jharkhand state of India is an example. In many other states of the country, sexuality education programs have stalled because of resistance. Jharkhand, on the other hand, a small state in northeastern India, has been able to scale up education statewide and sustain it for 5 years. So the point is, how can we learn from these country experiences? And in the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you 3 examples. Let me begin with the case of Pakistan. In Pakistan, you have a national policy on sexuality education which is in place. But there's very little large-scale and sustained government-led implementation. So a group of NGOs, a loose group of NGOs, have been working to move the agenda using the available enabling policy. What they did was they strategically chose issues to address that communities felt were important. For example, child marriage, early childbearing, violence against women, sexual harassment of girls on the street. These were issues that community members felt that it was important to talk to adolescents about. Second is they framed the issues very carefully. They did not use terms like sexuality education. On the other hand, they used terms such as life skills-based education. So they used terms which would not raise opposition. The third thing they did was they developed the content very carefully and had it vetted. Had it vetted by technical experts, had it vetted by religious leaders whom they could engage. And so they had their blessings of a wide range of influential stakeholders. And finally, they reached out to the community in a number of different fora, including street theater, to explain what they were doing and why they were doing it. So they worked very hard to build community support. But they had to deal with backlash, as in many other places. The backlash, for instance, came from a group of Islamic religious parties, Islamic political groups, religious groups, and media. An alliance of these groups came up and accused these organizations of corrupting children and young people and promoting ideas that were contrary to the principles of Pakistan. So what they did in such a situation was they decided not to go and meet these people face to face. They used intermediaries, supportive people in the media who could go and engage with the people who had published such reports. What they then did when the dust began to settle a little was they arranged for a wide range of journalists to come and visit schools to see what was happening, to see for themselves what was happening, to speak to teachers, to speak to the children, and to sit in the teaching sessions themselves. And these journalists then went and published a number of articles based on what they saw. And finally, they organized information and discussion sessions more proactively than they had in the past. And what has happened now is, despite many other problems that Pakistan is going through, these NGOs continue to do their sexuality education work and expand its application. Let me then move to another part of the world, Nigeria. Now, Nigeria is one of the few countries in sub-Saharan Africa which has scaled up sexuality education nationwide. How did they do that? They first built support for a national policy to be formed. A group of non-government organizations led by Action Health Incorporated demonstrated the need for sexuality education, the feasibility that it could be done in the context, in the local context in Lagos, and the effectiveness of delivering sexuality education. Based on this, they formed a national coalition to advocate for a national policy and a strategy. This took a long time. Over an 8-year period, the coalition worked with the support of both internal change agents and external change agents to engage the government and formulate a national policy. This was called Family Life and HIV Education. They had to, in order to bring various stakeholders on board, they had to agree on terminology that was acceptable to the majority and to leave out some content which they did not want to, but they had to compromise in order to build support. This was to formulate the policy. Then to roll out the family life and HIV education, they worked with state-level advisory and advocacy committees involving teachers, involving parent-teachers associations, working with religious leaders, working with political leaders, with proactive, energetic, ongoing consultations, which they continued. And so they were able to, for example, modify even terminology and content in some northern Muslim states in order to make it locally acceptable. Now, the program is not perfect. It has many flaws. People would say that it is a watered-down version of an ideal curriculum. But what they have been able to show in Nigeria is, even in the presence of a strong Islamic context and in the presence of resistance, both from Christian and Islamic leaders, they were able to find compromise, and they were also able to roll it out with the aid of a willing bureaucracy and a willing and engaged civil society. My last example is the case of Texas in the US. Now, often we think of barriers to sexuality education as a developing country problem, as something that happens in Nigeria, in Pakistan, and Bolivia. But the reality is that this is a problem in many other parts of the world, as you will see in this example. Now, in Texas, which contributes 12% to the entire teenage pregnancy of the USA, which covers 50 states, one state contributes 12%. The state government does not fund sexuality education. There's no obligation on schools to conduct sexuality education. So it's entirely a process of if the school district decides to do it, if the school board decides to do it, then it's done. So what a group of change agents, of non-government organizations, which include academics like Professor David Wiley, who published this report called A Conspiracy of Silence on the state of sexuality education in Texas. They worked hard to build community support by advocating with school board members about the link between school dropout and teenage pregnancy. So in order to make the case for keeping kids in school and for contributing to the economy of the state, they used the agenda of teenage pregnancy. They worked with school board members, and to appoint supporters of sexuality education in school health advisory councils. And they train and support these advisory council members. And in Texas, like everywhere else, when there is backlash, for example, a group of parents or a school health advisory council member who comes up with opposition, often needled by someone from the outside, then they lobby champions within the school advisory council based on relationships they have built to negate such opposition. So it is a school by school issue because there's no obligatory sexuality education. But what they've been able to do is slowly build the agenda and start moving from where they were 5 years ago. The situation is still not enviable at all. Half the schools still provide only abstinence-only education. Half the schools don't provide any sexuality education. And I'm sorry, a quarter of the schools don't provide any education, and a quarter of them provide abstinence plus education. So a huge amount of work still to be done in Texas, like in many other places. To wrap up, here is a brief report from Egypt, published by the Population Reference Bureau about 5 years ago. And what they said then was, a curriculum was developed in Egypt, a revolution took place, a new government comes into place and stops everything. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The sad thing in Egypt is it still continues to be stuck where it was 5 years ago. What we need to do is accept that there will be resistance and accept that we will need to navigate the barriers that opponents to sexuality education provide. There will be opposition. The question is, we need to compromise and find ways through the opposition as these other states have done. That is the challenge that we need to move forward with. So to conclude my presentation, we know that sexuality education is an important intervention that needs to reach children and adolescents. There are policies in many places. There's research evidence of effectiveness. But because of opposition, either it has not taken off or where it has taken off, it has stalled. I've given you 3 country experiences, examples of countries which have worked hard to build support and overcome resistance. And that is what all of us need to do because resistance is absolutely going to continue to grow. Thank you.